Hey everyone. Tonight, I'm sharing a real spine-chilling story from Reddit. If you love horror, hit subscribe for more terrifying tales. Now, let's dive in. Don't watch this alone. My neighbor perched himself on top of a pine tree in my backyard and never came down. Only a day later, the sheriff of our small town did the same. When Henry perched himself atop of that pine tree, I thought he'd just lost his damn mind. No amount of convincing from Jim or the sheriff could coax him down. He ascended into the canopy and never returned. Never returned alive, at least. He'd always been an eccentric. It wasn't easy living next door to Henry, but it certainly wasn't dull either. Between the small city of birdhouses he maintained around the perimeter of his two-story house, the free home-brewed mead that appeared on our doorstep the first of every month, and the early morning French horn recitals, he was a handful. I rather liked the ongoing spectacle, all things considered. Jim never really saw the humor in Henry's mania. That said, crippling agoraphobia has prevented me from leaving the house for almost a year now. So my threshold for what qualifies as entertainment is quite a low bar to clear. My husband was on his way to confront Henry about his newest hobby, metal detecting, when he first scaled that 20-foot-tall pine in our backyard. It wasn't the act of metal detecting that bothered Jim. It was the many untended holes that vexed him. The 60-something-year-old found himself too lost in paroxysms of archaeological fervor to bother filling the quarries back up with soil after he made them. After days of steady excavation, it looked like Henry had been sweeping his property for landmines. That morning, Jim saw the man creeping towards the edge of the forest 30 yards from our kitchen window, and he sprung into action. If I'm recalling correctly, he shouted something like, "I'm going to nip this in the bud," as he jogged out the front door, which now carries a cruel cosmic irony when examined in retrospect. The scene unfolded before me through the dusty lens of our den's cheap telescope, which has a lovely panoramic view of the backyard and the thicket beyond from where we keep it. As much as it pains me to admit it, fear of the space outside my house has turned me into a bit of a snoop. Jim sauntered up to our neighbor, but Henry didn't turn around to greet him, nor did he stop lurching forward. He didn't even react to Jim, as far as I could tell. It was like he was moving in slow-motion autopilot. Although irritated, it wasn't like my husband's molten rage drove Henry to the top of that pine out of a concern for his safety. No matter what Jim did or said, Henry remained locked in an impenetrable trance. A man on a mission, he gave up on catching Henry's attention by the time he had made it 3/4 of the way up. As Jim started to walk back, I kept watching. Henry, the sleepwalker, never changed his pace. Each identical movement was eerily slow and deliberate. After reaching the apex, he positioned himself to face our home, extended both arms, palms up in front of his chest, and became impossibly still, an unblinking gargoyle baking in the early morning summer sun. At least, I thought he was stationary. When I checked on him an hour later through the telescope, however, he had spun his torso about 30 degrees west. Arms still extended, eyes still open, but his body had turned. Concerned and captivated in equal measure, I began observing him continuously. While I watched, nothing seemed to change, and I was becoming progressively unnerved by his uncanny stillness. But when I paused my vigil after about 20 minutes, something occurred to me. He was moving. I could tell when I brought my eye away from the telescope. Looking through the den window, His torso had clearly pivoted another 15 degrees clockwise. The motion was just so slow that I found it hard to perceive in real time. I put my eye back to the lens of the telescope. Henry's skin was developing a red sheen. His unblinking eyes were dry and tinged with brown specks like overcooked egg whites. That's when I called the sheriff. The grizzled southerner and his doe-eyed deputy arrived quickly, seeing as they were only a 3-minute drive down the road. They stood at the base of that pine for an hour, but couldn't find the language to persuade Henry down either. Flustered and out of patience, the sheriff told us he would involve the fire department tomorrow if Henry remained in the tree. When night fell, I couldn't visualize Henry through the telescope anymore, but I could hear him. From our bedroom window, faintly sobbing somewhere in the blackness. I found myself posted up in the den before the sun even rose, my mind burning with curiosity. Black coffee trickled down my throat, warming my marrow. For a moment, I felt ashamed of the excitement rumbling around in my chest. The more I reflected on the sensation, however, the more I understood it. Journalism used to be my life, before the cumulative horrors I documented manifested as a crippling fear of the world. In the grand scheme of things, this stakeout was pathetic. It didn't hold a candle to what I had done before, in a past life. But fascination, not dread, drove me to do it, and that held value. Henry had not moved from his steeple, and by the time the sun appeared over the horizon, he had stifled his tears. His biceps were red and swollen, likely muscle breakdown from keeping them outstretched in the same position for over 24 hours. A little after 8, Jim made his way downstairs. He was unusually quiet. Initially, I attributed his silence to low-level distress, secondary to Henry's unexplained behavior. When I finally noticed him, he was standing by the front door, away from the view of our neighbor's macabre display. I asked him if he was doing all right, and he replied with an affirmative grunt. So I left him be. Around noon, I felt a theory crystallize in my skull. Henry was twisting around the tree's axis with a pace and direction identical to yesterday's. He must be watching something, I thought. That's when it hit me. Henry was angling his eyes and his body to constantly face the sun. My mind scrambled to process this observation, but Jim's heavy breathing behind me broke my concentration. It scared the shit out of me because I didn't hear him approach. Startled, I urged him to explain what the hell he was doing. "Oh, fixing clock," he replied. Except there was no clock. In actuality, he had his face pressed to the window that was to the right of me. He was staring at something. I didn't want to believe it at first, but by the afternoon, I was forced to confront the realization. From where I sat in the den, I could see Henry's back through the telescope, and when I moved my eye away, I could see Jim's back, silently gazing forward. Early that morning, he had been watching the sun rise from our front door, just the same as Henry had from atop the pine tree. My husband was following the trajectory as well. Before I could dial 911, the sheriff and his deputy appeared in my peripheral vision. My burst of relief was short-lived when I observed how they were walking. Their footfalls were languid and protracted, the same as Henry's had been yesterday. As their hands contacted 2 different pine trees in unison, I refocused the telescope on Henry. To my horror, they were not climbing the tree where my neighbor sat to rescue him. The possessed men were scaling their own trees, each equidistant from Henry's. In a state of detached shock, I moved a shaky hand to my notebook to jot down one last detail I had noticed about Henry. Tiny mushrooms had sprouted from his eye sockets, palms, and his open mouth. A robin rested on his forehead, nibbling at the growing fungus. A wave of primal terror washed over me, and I sprinted from the chair to my front door, pausing as my hand twisted the knob. I tried to force myself through the threshold. My head pivoted back to Jim for motivation, who hadn't moved an inch, in spite of the noise of the chair and the telescope crashing to the floor when I sprang up. Unable to overcome my agoraphobia, I instead sat down on the doormat and placed my head in my hands. Whatever Henry succumbed to, it had spread to the sheriff, the deputy, and my husband. I contemplated calling 911, but what if it just spread to emergency medical services as well? I'm not sure how long I lingered there, catatonic. The blood-chilling wails of my husband returned my consciousness to my body. It had become night. The absence of natural light had made Jim into a messy human puddle on the kitchen floor. I tiptoed over to my husband, doing my best to ignore the pangs of terror vibrating in my spine. He had simply crumbled where he stood when the sun set, kneeling unnaturally with his chest and torso leaning against the wall below our kitchen window. Despite knowing he wasn't, I asked if he was okay a handful of times, receiving no reply. Standing over him, I tilted his shoulder, trying to see his face. Jim limply fell over in response. He was still crying softly, eyes open, but producing no tears. That's when I noticed his chest wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing. When I found the courage to check, he had no pulse, and I lost consciousness. I woke up a few hours later. Through the telescope, I could see my husband perched on a pine tree of his own, arms outstretched and eyes still open. Hellish choreography modeled by Henry, mimicked by the sheriff, the deputy, and Jim. My current theory is as follows. Henry must have accidentally unearthed something old and terrible digging holes in his backyard. A parasitic fungus lying dormant under the soil, infecting everyone who went near with inhaled spores once it was exposed. I'm going to make it outside today. I'll grab a shovel from the garage and I'll fill every single hole Henry made with layers of soil. Maybe I'll survive uninfected, but I suspect I will succumb to whatever this thing is as well. It's the least I can do to honor Jim's memory. I'm taking the time to document and post this for two reasons. First and foremost, don't end up like me. I hid from the world because it felt safer, but it wasn't safer, it was just easier, and I wasted precious time. Secondly, if you see anyone perched on a tree, eyes following the trajectory of the sun, burn the tree down or run. Whatever you do, cover your mouth, because that robin ate some of the fungus that grew from Henry and may disseminate the spores as far as it can fly. The start of its life cycle? It's unclear. And I think that, unfortunately, the world may have an answer to that question in a few days. Thank you so much for staying with me till the end. If you enjoyed this story and it sent shivers down your spine, please give this video a like. Your support means the world to me, and it helps me bring more stories like this to you. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss out on the next chilling tale. Your subscription inspires me to create better and scarier content just for you. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and don't forget to watch your back. See you soon.